North Korea blasted 2 rounds of missile tests over the past week. 2 cruise missiles on Sunday, which Seoul and Washington downplayed, then 2 ballistic missiles on Thursday, which clearly breaches United Nations Security Council resolutions. North Korea has been known to surprise new US presidents with an orchestrated bang. The regime fired missiles 75 days after Mr. Obama took office and 23 days after Mr. Trump swore in 2017. So upon President Joe Biden's second month in office, these missile launches might seem like a rite of passage at this point. But after the Trump-Kim nuclear talks, though unsuccessful in getting a deal, provided an unprecedented turning point in US-North Korea relations, there has been a great deal of interest over how the Biden administration would set the course of engagement. But it looks like North Korea couldn't wait for Washington to finish its policy review. And today we discuss the motive behind Pyongyang's latest provocation. For this, we're joined by Soo Kim, policy analyst at Rand Corporation and former CIA analyst. We also connect with John Delury, professor at Yonsei University's Graduate School of International Studies based here in Seoul. It's lovely to have you both back on the show. Thank you so much for joining us. And well, to discuss North Korea's latest provocation, one of many. Now, Soo, North Korea, it fired a second round of missiles on Thursday, which the regime announced just a few hours ago was a new type of tactical ballistic missile. And this came after President Joe Biden said that he does not consider the North's initial firing of cruise missiles over the weekend a provocation. Do you think that Pyongyang had actually planned the second launch, or do you think it was a reaction, or it was a show of dissatisfaction at Biden's rather vanilla response?
So I think it's a combination of both. I mean, North Korea's not dealing with a new set of US responses or non-reaction. So this is something that was probably in the playbook. But I do think that the US president, the first comment that he makes publicly in response to a North Korean provocation, to say that it's business as usual and to laugh it off, I think is akin to basically splashing cold water on Kim Jong-un's face. And although this is probably something that he has sort of calculated and thought about, it does give Kim Jong-un, I think, a pretty good assessment as to where some of the I guess the rough boundaries are in terms of dealing with the new administration.
And John, now let's look back at North Korea's first launch of cruise missiles last weekend. This actually came after US Secretary of State Antony Blinken left the peninsula after meeting with Seoul officials. What do you think the message was, the message that Pyongyang was trying to send to the Biden administration with this launch? Do you think it might have also been a bit worried or nervous about the US-China meeting that went on in Alaska, which was obviously quite vitriolic?
Yeah, I might caution against overreading this from a Biden perspective. Obviously, the North Koreans are aware that there's a new administration that it's conducting, evidently in the final stages of its policy review about them. So they would certainly think through, consider the implications of this. And I think at a minimum, what we can say is, the fact that the administration is deciding in the final stages of deciding how it's going to start its approach to North Korea didn't prevent them from the test, from both tests. But that's quite different from saying it explains even the timing of the test or why they're doing the tests. I mean, we should keep in mind there's a lot of other audiences. There's always a domestic audience in North Korea, which we tend to ignore. We're here in South Korea, and in fact, if you look at the first round of tests was preceded by statements. The first statement was, of course, from Kim Jong-un's sister, and really she was addressing South Korea, not the United States. So there's a South Korean audience. Meanwhile, both these tests, the cruise missiles were to the west, actually toward China, and we have to think about China's reaction to this. And then the second test, the ballistic missiles, were to the east toward Japan. So I think it's a lot more complicated than Joe Biden and his policy review. There are multiple audiences, and it's playing out in different ways on all those levels.
What are your thoughts on this, Soo? Do you think North Korea, what message do you think it was trying to send, really? Do you think it was feeling threatened by the rallying of America's allies?
So I do agree with Dr. Delury in that there are definitely multiple parts moving at the same time. The fact that the United States and China ended their meeting in Alaska on not so good terms, I think it's I think you can kind of think it in both ways. Where in some ways, of course, the fact that the United States and China did not really get along is no surprise. And it also sends, I guess, some alarm to Kim Jong-un that, things are going to be rough for him. At the same time, I think the fact that Washington and Beijing are still kind of, there's a wedge between them, it also presents an opportunity, I think, for Kim Jong-un, where he knows that unless the two sides, that's Washington and Beijing, are able to find some kind of common ground on whatever issue, that the cooperation, the prospect for cooperation between the two countries over North Korea are going to be slimmer. So that means, of course, for Kim Jong-un that he's will be foreseeing maybe challenges for Biden in terms of reducing the North Korean nuclear threat for one, but also just trying to rein Kim Jong-un in so that just as he did in the past week, he's not really acting out as much.
And John, now the initial cruise missile test took place over the weekend, but we heard about it days later. Why do you think Seoul and Washington waited to reveal that North Korea had fired missiles over the weekend?
Well, I'm not sure what their thought process was, but if we look at the statements, particularly from the American side, in response to that first test, they were really, trying to, you could say downplay it, but I think accurately downplay it, describing it as normal military activity. It is, frankly, normal military activity in this region, and you don't want to overreact. So again, that's why I'm not convinced that North Korea was upset that Joe Biden kind of laughed off the first test. I would read it slightly differently. I think that the administration, at least in terms of both, not rushing forward with the information, I guess, to the public, and then when it came out, to put it in context and not sort of hype it up. I think they were trying to keep the temperature cool and not actually feed a cycle of provocation, as we always describe it. That's harder with the second set of tests. And of course, at this point, it's conceivable that we're at the beginning of however long, weeks, maybe months of tests with some regularity, and that will pose a great challenge to the Biden administration because that creates constant pressure on them and expectations and concerns to some extent domestically in the United States, probably more here in the region where folks feel more directly threatened by North Korea. And so that generates a lot of pressure on the Biden administration to say, what are you doing about this? Where are we going, and what's the solution?
And see, as John just said, President Biden was obviously trying to keep things calm and rather cool. But of course, after the second round of missiles, he did warn the North that they shouldn't overstep the mark, otherwise they would face action from the United States. From this incident, we are, of course, all waiting for the North Korea policy review from the US. Do you think this incident might provide any hints as to how the administration will take its North Korea policy?
So I think that it's not just their response to this particular incident, but I think we've seen adequate signaling or the lack of signaling at times that actually is a signal from the Biden administration that things are going to be different from the Trump administration. So the era of symmetry, haphazard decision making, it's a bygone era, and they wanted to let Kim Jong-un and I guess also the other parties that might be involved, South Korea, Japan, China, and Russia, that this is going to be a different administration. It's a new team. We might see, of course, as we've seen so far, a more tempered approach as well as more principles. But I think also one thing that we have to be cautious about, and it's not just from the U.S. perspective, but just all around, I think Dr. Delury alluded to this as well, is that sometimes we tend to overreact when it comes to North Korea provocations, and that's actually feeding the beast a lot more than just sort of downplaying, dismissing. And I think the response that we saw after the second test this week does give a little bit more of a definition as to where things might be going during this administration. And we'll have to see what comes out from the policy review and the National Security Advisors meetings that are going to be taking place next week with his counterparts.
And John, we all know that North Korea has a rather unique and cryptic style of communication. And well, after warning Washington not to make a stink last week, it fired off these 2 rounds of missile launches over the past week. Does this indicate that the regime wants something? Is it in a hurry to talk?
Well, what strikes me, in fact, if you look at signaling and how do we read North Korea, you look at today and we're all talking about the missiles and we're focused on the missiles and the technical aspects of it and what message could be in there for the Biden administration and others. But if you're a North Korean and you pick up your daily newspaper, as you're maybe obliged to look at, you're not going to see on the front page, you're not going to see pictures of the missiles. You're going to see Kim Jong-un inspecting the big new campaign to build apartment houses, as well as, I guess, there's a new line of passenger buses. And, we can almost laugh at that, but I think it's actually quite significant in that Kim Jong-un did not attend, so far as I know, was not reported attending either of these launches, which of course he does do, has done many times in the past. He's not there. Instead, what is the message he's sending? I'm focused on economic development. And so, that is the hopeful signal that this is a leader who is actually still on the message of his original promise when he took power from his father, which is you're not going to have to tighten your belts under me. I will, finally make this a prosperous country. And, despite the fact that they keep their strategic weapons program and keep improving those capabilities, he has not given up on that idea, that promise of economic development. And one hopes that this is where the diplomats, once they're done with their review and really get to work, and in particular start talking to their North Korean counterparts, can find a way out of this, a way toward common interests, which address even human rights abuses in terms of the suffering that North Koreans undergo because of living in an isolated, impoverished country. So I think we have to really look carefully at the signals, and again, not focus only on the missiles as a provocation, as a challenge, as a test to Joe Biden.
Well, how do you see this, CD? How are you reading the signals from North Korea, and what do you think might be its next step if we, perhaps misread these signals that we're getting from the regime? Sorry, Sue, I'm afraid we can't hear you very well.
Let me try this again. Can you hear me now?
Oh, there we go. We've got the audio back.
Okay, great. So I read this, I do see that the economics plays, into it's a component of it. I read it a little bit differently in that the provocations, of course, are geared towards an audience. And Kim Jong-un, of course, has a domestic audience also in mind. But we also have to keep in mind where these economic development projects are leading, whether or not they're actually turning out to benefit the good of the North Korean population. It's unclear to me just how much these changes are going to be trickling down to the very lowest levels of North Korean society. What I do see, or what I do sort of fathom that's happening with Kim Jong-un right now is that the signals that he's sending is, of course, geared towards the United States. As for whether or not he's wanting to talk and he's pressuring the United States for that objective, there's a possibility, of course, and I don't think that North Korea would ever be deep inside unwilling to talk to the United States, because there's always an opportunity to get something out of it. But I also think that even if Kim Jong-un is able to throw a rock into the pond and see just how much of a ripple it causes in the United States, that's, of course, in the psyche of the Biden administration, I think that's also going to be enough for him to work with for the remaining 4 years. So I think all in all, just to see a U.S. response or even a non-response is going to be something for Kim Jong-un to work with. And if that materializes into, from talks or negotiations, even better. But I think at this point, North Korea probably knows the United States a lot better than the United States knows North Korea. So we can conjecture as much as we want, but I think that he has a set of options, and I think that whatever we do, it's going to give him additional material to work with.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time, so this is where we'll have to leave the interview until North Korea unites us once again. But that was Soo Kim, policy analyst at RAND Corporation and former CIA analyst, and John Delury, professor at Yonsei University's Graduate School of International Studies. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you very much for watching.